looking for a distraction the other day, I ended up watching the first episode of House of Cards. Anyone know it? No. Yeah. So it's kind of fun. The scene is Washington, D.C. The main character is the Congress whip, played by Kevin Spacey. He's so good at doing mean and spooky. So though Kevin Spacey, the Congress whip, is expecting to be given the role of Secretary of State by the president-elect. He's just waiting for it to be handed to him. That was the plan. And then he was overlooked for someone else. All politics, of course. And he vows to secretly take down his own administration. It plays like a really good game of chess. Anyway, in the first episode, kind of surprise, surprise, there was a church scene. They were all in church. All the newly elected have gathered. And the preacher, and I was thinking, boy, what would it be like to be in his shoes on any day of the week? In his sermon was suggesting that they might want to balance their quest for power with a bit of humility. Well, it didn't look like anyone in the crowd that day was prepared to take any words of Jesus seriously. In his book, Falling Upward, Spirituality for the Second Half of Life, Rohr contrasts this kind of striving for power and possessions and reputation, which is at the heart of the North American understanding of success, with a striving for what the soul really longs for. And he's not poo-pooing the work of the first half of life. He would suggest that, yes, the first half of our life is spent creating a container. I mean, we do need to put food on the table. We do need to strive for clothing, shelter, education, vocation, etc. But the scene in that television show shows what happens when that goes a bit too far. And we all have our own personal stories of what happens when that striving sets us out of balance. Jesus, too, lives in a world where a few players both make all the rules and win all the games. Or so it would seem. Jesus argues, though, that in fact there is nothing to be gained by that constant striving, the accumulation of things, and all the anxiety that accompanies that journey. And as only Jesus can, he flips the invitation upside down and invites us instead to let go. Let go of our attachments to security, whatever form they might take. Let go of our attachments to being right. That's a hard one. Let go of our attachments to all of those categories that we insist separate us and make us superior to one another. We might be wanting to be paying attention to that one as an election comes up, and it becomes about them and us, and all the different permutations of them and us, and right and wrong, and black and white. One of the people who I think has been so able to follow this alternative pilgrimage that Jesus lays down, person in our time, is Nelson Mandela. He reflected as he was about to be released from prison. He said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead me to my freedom, I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, that I would still be in prison." This is not a statement of a man who is in the first half of his life trying to make a name for himself. This is the statement of a man who has been refined by fire and through it has learned life's deepest spiritual truths, without which he could not have led a broken, wounded, divided South Africa to a place of new beginning. So let's unpack this for a moment in order to make some connections for ourselves. After 25 years in prison, some of those years spent in isolation for providing leadership in a movement meant to bring equality to South Africa, what is it that Nelson Mandela let go of? He speaks about anger and bitterness. It's bigger than that, though, I think. It's recognizing that somehow peace without cannot be established without peace within. It's acknowledging that this endless cycle of power and abuse just perpetuates another endless cycle of power and abuse unless you take yourself to another universe altogether. A universe where you are no longer keeping score. A universe where you find the grace to forgive those whose actions are unforgivable. A universe where all the old rules about what is fair and what is right no longer apply. A universe where you aren't always looking for someone else to blame. Where you realize that at the end of the day, that blaming game doesn't get you anywhere. Mandela, I think, is an example of someone who, like Jesus, gave up his life, and in giving it up, found the kingdom of God within him. And it is to this other universe that Jesus calls us when he says, stop striving to build up things that won't serve you in the long run. And stop being anxious about things over which you have no control. Let it go. Imagine yourself on your deathbed, and do any of the things that keep you up at night really matter? But because many of us are masters of anxiety, masters of huffing and puffing about things that we cannot change, masters at living in self-righteousness and superiority, the gospel provides a second invitation. It is an invitation to die. And I suspect as you think about how often you've heard that invitation in your life, particularly if you've been connected to the Christian tradition throughout your life, just thinking about it, I think I hear that invitation so differently as I look through the different ages and stages of my life. And finally I hear that invitation, and it actually comes as good news these days. I'm not sure it always did. An invitation to die, an invitation to lose your life in order to find the one you were meant to live. And this is where Richard Rohr enters the conversation with an invitation to get beyond our commitment to the things of this world in order to discover within ourselves another kind of kingdom. But it's not the work that everyone chooses to do. It's not the work that everyone is capable of doing. And so sometimes life intervenes. Rohr writes, there must be, and if we are honest, there always will be, at least one situation in our lives that we cannot fix, control, explain, change, or even understand. For Jesus and for his followers, the crucifixion became the dramatic symbol of that necessary and absurd stumbling stone. End of quote. Now, I'm not one of those there's a reason for everything people. I think that's quite absurd. But what if we were to shift that claim, as does Paula Darcy, who suggests that God comes to you disguised as your life. God comes to you disguised as your life. which means that those tragedies, those challenges, those heartaches, those horrible mistakes, those betrayals are not meant to be, but can be used by God to take you to another place. Not necessarily a place you would ask to go, but a place that once you get there feels like home. And it's unfortunate that life in North America has become so cushy that we live with this illusion that it's all supposed to be perfect, that somehow death and sickness are mistakes in life as opposed to part of life. And we rage against them, and we deny any fear of them, and we pretend that we are immune to them. Almost like children who refuse to grow up. And then over the years and over the centuries, we've added some really rotten theology that says that we're not supposed to make mistakes, rather than recognizing that in our mistakes may be the greatest opportunities for us to connect with heaven. But the world that Jesus lived in was anything but a perfect world. Suffering was a part of that world, and while it wasn't meant to be, it is a place where he invited them to, through that suffering, connect more deeply to the mystery that we call God. Pema Chodron, the Buddhist teacher who lives in Nova Scotia, was asked about her greatest life lesson. Compassion, she replied. It's the most important thing that I have learned. How did you learn it? She was asked. Through suffering, she said. And while she said that she didn't welcome the suffering, she was grateful that it had been such a fine teacher. The gospel would argue, as would Richard Rohr, that sometimes you have to lose your life in order to save it. Something needs to end, to fall apart, and that may come in the form of a health issue or a relationship issue or a job, or perhaps even a whole way of thinking, in order to find yourself in a universe that is much more life-giving, gracious, spirit-blown, and compassionate. And who would choose to do that? Who would put a journey like that on their agenda? But those who have made that journey will tell you that they have landed in a place where they were much more prepared to forgive themselves, much less gentle and at peace with their neighbor, much more accepting of the fragility of life, and therefore much more grateful and content with life itself. Karen Takash, the woman among our circle of friends who'd been the volunteer with Reaching for Rainbows, who was battling brain cancer, who spoke to us a little before Christmas, died earlier this week at the age of 54. I have printed her obituary on the insert. She recommended that her friends read a book by Stephen Levine called How to Live This Year as If It Were Your Last. Her friends, like Elizabeth, who is also among our circle of friends, would tell you that Karen's greatest legacy to them, as she traveled what she called her cancer pilgrimage, was to serve as a living reminder that life in all of its circumstances was a gift to be loved. And so basically her invitation to her friends was to make sure they fell in love with life every day. In June, she gave a gift of $2,000 to Reaching for Rainbows, proceeds from the sale of her art. In the letter of gratitude that I wrote to her on our behalf, I wished her peace and joy as she proceeded along the final leg of her journey. I thought very hard about whether or not I should use that word joy, but I had a sense that joy was very much part of her pilgrimage. Because she, using Rohr's imagery, I think, learned to fall upwards into the mystery of love that cradles us all. Throughout this time for contemplation, I wonder how the mystery might be calling you to let go of old resentments, old griefs, or just frustration with all the things you can't change, like getting old. I don't know, can you relate to that? Letting it go, even for this 4 minutes, in order to open your arms and accept and love the life that you have.